The livery at the edge of Gideon's Crossing smelled the way all liveries smelled: hay and old manure, and the particular sweat of animals that had been asked to work hard and hadn't been asked much else. She had been sitting outside it for the better part of an hour on an overturned feed crate, her bag between her feet, watching the street. The town was not what she had expected, but then she had learned not to expect things. Expecting was a way of setting up a disappointment in advance, and she had enough of those without scheduling them. The letter was in her coat pocket. She had folded and unfolded it enough times that the paper had gone soft at the creases. She knew it well enough that reading it again wouldn't tell her anything new, but she put her hand against the outside of her pocket anyway. The way you check a thing you already know is there. The ranch runs about 400 acres of grazing land. The letter had said, "I have horses and one hired man who handles the cattle end. What I need is someone who can manage the household side and has some experience with animals. I will be plain with you. I am not an easy man to talk to, but I am a fair one. The work is steady and the pay is honest, and there is a room with a window that faces east." That last detail, the window, the direction it faced, had been the thing that made her write back. A man who thought to mention which way a window faced was a man who had considered the person who would be looking out of it. She had written back the same afternoon. That was 3 months ago. A boy of about 9 was watching her from the doorway of the dry goods across the street. Not rudely, just the open curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking. She met his eyes once. He didn't flinch. She looked away first, which was a thing she did not often do. When the wagon came, she heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of iron wheels on packed dirt and a horse that was breathing easy, not pushed. A gray mare, well kept. The man holding the reins was older than she'd imagined from the handwriting. Or maybe not older, maybe just worn in a specific way. The way men got who worked land alone for a long time. He stopped in front of the livery and climbed down without hurry. He looked at the street first, then the livery, then her. She stood. He came toward her without any ceremony of approach. He stopped at a reasonable distance and looked at her bag, and then at her. He had gray at his temples and a line between his brows that wasn't from squinting. It was the kind of line that came from thinking hard about things that didn't resolve. He said, "You came on the morning stage." It wasn't a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry about the wait. The north fence needed attention." She had been waiting an hour, and he apologized for it once, and that was the end of it. That was already something. She picked up her bag. He looked at it and looked at her, and she understood he was deciding whether to offer. She held it in a way that made the decision easy for him. He lifted the trunk from where it had been left on the boardwalk and carried it to the wagon without asking if she needed help and without making any particular show of not asking. She climbed up on her own side. He climbed up on his. The gray mare moved when he gathered the reins, smooth and without argument. The town moved past them on either side. The boy in the doorway was still watching. She did not look back. The road west of town was dry and wide, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that didn't ask anything of you. She watched it. Beside her, he drove the same way he'd walked, without performance, without any particular awareness that she might be observing him. She had spent enough time around men who were always aware of being observed to know the difference. It registered somewhere. After a while, he said, "The mare's name is Opal. She's 15 and she knows the road better than I do." She said, "Does she have opinions about it?" He glanced at her sideways. Something shifted briefly at the corner of his mouth. "She has opinions about most things." They didn't speak again for a while. The road curved through a stand of cottonwoods that were going gold at the edges and then opened out onto flat rangeland, pale and enormous. She could see the ranch before he said anything. The house sat low against the horizon, a long structure of weathered wood with a newer section on the west end showing lighter boards. A barn behind it, and past the barn a series of pole corrals where 4 horses stood in the afternoon shade. He turned onto the track leading in. "The porch boards are solid except the one on the far left," he said. "I've been meaning to replace it." She noted that he said meaning to rather than intending to, a small difference. It meant he was honest about the gap between intention and action. She said, "All right." The yard was swept dirt and practical. No garden, no attempt at decoration. A rusted hand pump near the barn door. several coils of rope hanging from a post with the deliberateness of a man who kept track of where things were. She liked that. He set her trunk on the porch and held the door. Inside, the front room held a stone fireplace, a table, 3 chairs that didn't match, and 2 windows. The floor was board plank, clean in the way of places swept regularly but not obsessively. She walked through once, slowly, the way you walk through a place you are deciding whether to stay in. There was a hall off the back of the front room, 3 doors. He opened the third. The room was small. A bed with a plain coverlet, a chest at the foot, a hook on the wall, and the window facing east exactly as described. The light at this hour was neutral, the sun having moved past it, but she could see the angle it would come from in the morning. Long and low across the floor, she set her bag down on the chest. He was in the doorway. He said, "There's water in the kitchen. I'll tend to Opal and be back before dark," she said. "I'll have something on the stove." He looked at her once briefly, without reading anything into the offer that she hadn't put there. Then he went out. She heard his boots on the porch, the careful step around the loose board, and then the yard. She stood in the room for a moment. Then she went to find the kitchen. The pantry had flour and salt and dried beans and a smoked ham on a hook near the ceiling. 2 cast iron pans hung on the wall, both seasoned black and even. She found a Dutch oven on the bottom shelf and a crock of lard beside it. There were onions braided and hanging near the window. She looked at what was there the way she looked at most new things, as inventory, as possibility, as the beginning of understanding what kind of man she had come to work for. The beans wanted too long. She cut the ham instead, found a pot that would do, added the onions, and set everything over the heat. While it cooked, she went through the rest of the kitchen with attention. The dishes were plain and adequate. The tinned cups were dented in ways that told their age. There was a small crock of something near the window with a cloth over it that turned out to be starter. Old, well-kept, fed regularly. She didn't know what to make of a man who kept sourdough starter alive through a summer and a fall. She put the cloth back and went on with supper. He came in when the smell had been going a while. She heard him at the pump outside, the handle working, and then boots on the porch step. He washed his hands at the basin and dried them on the cloth by the door. He looked at the pot and didn't say anything. He sat down. She put food in front of him and sat across with her own. He ate the way she had expected, without theater, without any awareness of being watched, the way you eat when you have been doing it alone long enough that the fact of another person hasn't changed the habit yet. She ate and looked at the room and the fire and took note of what she saw. When he was done, he said, "It's good," she said. "The beans would have been better. I didn't have time." He said, "They'll keep." He set his plate in the basin. Not her work this time, or he hadn't decided yet whose work it was. She filed that away. The first week went the way first weeks do when you are learning a place. She burned the left side of the cornbread because the oven was uneven and corrected for it the next time. She found the water pressure at the pump was better in the morning before the sun hit the pipe. She learned that he took his coffee with nothing in it, and that he was at the barn before light and back for breakfast after, and that there was a rhythm to the ranch that had been set before she arrived, and that she was now moving inside of, learning its edges. He didn't explain the routine. He didn't need to. She watched and adjusted. On the third morning, a man named Declan came up from the bunkhouse for breakfast. He was in his 50s, weathered the way outdoor men weather, and he looked at her with a directness that was not disrespectful, only assessing. She looked back the same way. He said, "Heard you came out of Cheyenne." She said she had. He nodded and ate and didn't ask further. She appreciated that. After Declan left, she washed the plates and looked out the window at the south field. He was out there with the gray mare and a length of fence wire, working a section that had gone slack. She watched without being obvious about it. He worked with the economy of a man who had done the same task many times and had stopped thinking about how to do it and only did it. There was something in that she recognized, the absence of wasted motion. She turned back to the bread dough. By the end of the first week, she had established certain things without discussion. The laundry on Mondays, the bread every other day. The kitchen was hers in the mornings and shared in the evenings, and he never came into it when she was working without a reason. That was a thing she hadn't known she needed until she had it. On Friday of the first week, he came in at midday and said, Without preface, the East Corral gate is sticking. Would you look at it? She said, I don't know gates. He said, I'll show you. They went out together. The gate was a heavy pole affair on a leather hinge that had dried and warped. He showed her how the hinge worked and what it needed, and where the oil was kept and how much to use. She watched his hands, not his face. He had the hands of a man who had injured them and healed them many times and kept going. She had known enough of those. She oiled the hinge and worked it until it moved freely. He watched without comment. When she was done, he said, Good, and that was all. That evening, she sat at the table with her mending, and he sat across with a ledger, going over something in a column of figures. The lamp between them was low. The fire had settled to coals. Outside, the wind moved through the gap somewhere in the eave with a low, almost musical sound. She worked without looking up and was aware of him in the way you become aware of weather, not watching for it, only knowing it was there. He said, without looking up from the ledger, Declan says the North herd needs moving before the freeze. She said, When? 2 weeks, maybe 3, and you need 2 people for that. He looked up then, not sharply. With attention, you've done it before. It wasn't a question, she said, some. He looked back down at his ledger. I'll let you know when we're close to time. She went back to her mending. The lamp worked between them for another hour. When she finally looked up, he was still at the ledger, but the pencil wasn't moving. He was staring at a number in the column and not seeing it. She had seen that look before, the look of a man adding something up that wasn't going to come out right. She didn't ask. She said, I'm going to bed, and gathered her mending. He said, Good night, and meant it. She slept better that night than she had in months. She didn't think about why. The sourdough starter was the thing she decided to bake from on the following Tuesday. She fed it the night before, and by morning it had doubled, alive and sharp smelling. She made bread from it, and it came out better than the loaves she'd been making. A better crumb, a better crust. She cut it while it was still warm and left it on the board. When he came in, he stopped at the board and looked at it. He said, Where did you find the starter? She said, Crock by the window. He was quiet a moment. That was my wife's, he said. She started it before. He stopped. She started it a long time ago. She looked at the bread and not at him. She said, I can put it back if you'd rather. He said, No. He paused. No, use it. That's what it's for. He took a slice and went back out, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and thought about what it meant to tend something that someone else had started. She didn't have a word for what she felt. She went on with the morning. A woman in town named Beryl worked at the post office and watched her with the frank curiosity of someone composing questions. The third time she came in for stamps, Beryl said, You're settling in out there. She said, I am. Beryl said, He's a quiet one. She said, Most men worth anything are. Beryl looked at her for a moment and then smiled in the way of a woman who has decided to approve of someone without being asked for her approval. She took her stamps and went. On the way back to the ranch, she thought about what she'd said. She had not meant it as anything. It had simply been true, and she had said it. The weather turned in the 3rd week, not the killing cold, but the kind of cold that means it's coming. She found an extra blanket in the chest at the foot of her bed, heavy wool, and put it across the coverlet. The floor of her room was cold in the mornings, until the stove in the front room had been going an hour. She started getting up before him. It was not a decision she made, it was simply what happened. Sleep stopped holding her at a certain hour, around 5, when the sky outside her window was still fully dark, but beginning to change at the edge of the ridge. She would lie there for a few minutes, and then she would get up. She had the fire going and the coffee on one morning when she heard him stop in the hallway outside the kitchen. She did not turn around. She heard him come to the doorway and stand there. He said, You don't have to do this. She said, I know. He came in and sat down, and she put a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the sky was going from black to a very deep blue, and the frost on the fence posts was just visible. They sat without speaking for a while. The fire worked at the cold, he said. Eventually, the starter is from 1889. She brought it from Ohio. She said, It's in good shape for its age, he said. She knew how to tend things. She didn't answer right away. She drank her coffee. Then she said, The bread was good this morning. He was quiet then. Yes, it was. Neither of them said anything after that for a while. But the silence was different from the earlier silences, lighter somehow. Or maybe not lighter, only older, as though it had been there longer than either of them. The cattle drive north took 3 days. She had been on similar drives before, but not for some years, and her body remembered the kind of tired that work from horseback made, a deep, specific ache in the hips and the small of the back that was different from any other fatigue. She didn't mention it. Declan rode on the far side of the herd, and she and he worked the near side, and the two of them found each other's rhythm without discussion, the way people do when they have been asked to do the same thing. On the second evening, they made camp on a flat above a dry creek bed. Declan made the fire, and she made food from what they'd packed, and the three of them ate with the sound of the cattle settling in the dark, and the stars coming out in numbers you never saw in town. He said, across the fire, "You sit a horse like you were born to it." She said, "My father worked cattle. I learned early." Declan said without looking up from his tin, "You keep things close," she said. "I do," he said. "Most do who've lost something." She didn't answer. There was nothing wrong with the observation. It was accurate. She looked at the fire and not at either of them, and they let her. In the morning, her hip ached, and she got up before it was light and walked the perimeter of the small camp to work it out. He was already up checking the horses. He saw her, and he didn't ask. He just brought her a cup of something hot that turned out to be coffee he'd made on the restarted coals. And she took it and drank it, standing in the gray light, and neither of them said anything about the hip or the early hour or the fact of the cup. That registered somewhere, filed away with the other things. They were back at the ranch by the third evening, with the herd settled in the north pasture and the horses watered, and Declan gone to the bunkhouse. She stood in the yard in the last of the light, her coat still on, her bag dropped by the porch step. She was tired in the good way that came from work done correctly. He came and stood a few feet away, looking at the north field. He said, "You didn't have to come on the drive. That's not what I hired you for." She said, "I know." He said, "But you're good at it." She said, "I know that too." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She had started to recognize the shape of that, the way his face moved when something landed right without his intending to show it. She picked up her bag. She said, "I'm going to sleep for 12 hours. He said, "You've earned it." She went inside. He stayed out a moment longer, looking at the field, and she watched him briefly through the window before she let the curtain fall. The winter came in earnest the week after, the kind of cold that announced itself clearly and didn't apologize. She banked the fires the way she'd learned to bank them in the house she'd grown up in. One hard frost was never just one. She added a second layer of weather stripping to the kitchen door and found the gap in the back bedroom siding and stuffed it with wool scraps from the mending basket. She did not tell him she'd done it. She heard him discover it one evening when he went to check on the back room and stood there a moment before going on. He said, "The next morning over coffee, you found the gap." She said, "It was cold in there." He said, "I know. I kept meaning to get to it." She drank her coffee. He said, "Thank you." She said, "It wasn't difficult." He said, "Most things need doing aren't difficult. They just need someone who notices them." She looked at him over her cup. He was looking out the window. She looked out the window too. The yard was white. Opal stood at the fence with her breath making small clouds in the cold. She said, "Your mare is asking for breakfast." He got up and went out, and she refilled her cup and sat with it in the quiet room. Beryl at the post office said, "One afternoon in December, you've been out there 4 months." She said, "Nearly." Beryl said, "Do you like it?" She looked at the stamps she was buying. She thought about the bread from the old starter and the east-facing window, and the sound of him on the stairs in the morning, and the 3 days moving cattle under the open sky. She thought about the gap in the siding she'd filled with wool, and the way he'd thanked her, and the fire that was always going when it needed to be, and how she had stopped running the arithmetic of leaving in her head sometime in the second month, and hadn't noticed until now. She said, "Yes." Beryl said, "That's a simple enough answer." She said, "It's a simple enough question." Beryl smiled. She took her stamps and went out into the cold. That evening, she sat at the table after supper, and he sat across with the ledger that had been bothering him for weeks. The number in the column still wasn't resolving. She could see that from the way he looked at it. she said, without looking up from her mending the north herd. He said, "What about it?" she said. "If you sell the 6 oldest steers before spring, you'll clear the difference." He looked up. She said, "Declan mentioned the price at the Harlan stockyards. The older ones will go for less per head, but there are 6 of them. It closes the gap." He set the pencil down. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on her mending. He said, "You worked that out." She said, "It wasn't difficult." He said, "You've been looking at my ledger." She said, "I haven't. Declan talks and I can add." A long moment. Then he said, "The number's been sitting there 3 weeks." She said, "I know." He looked at the ledger and then at her. She looked up this time. They looked at each other across the lamp and the table and the winter and the months behind them. He said, "I'll think about the steers." She said, "All right." He went back to the ledger. She went back to the mending. But something in the room had shifted, some proportion of things that she could feel without being able to name. She sat with it through the rest of the evening, the way she was learning to sit with things she didn't have words for yet. Not alarmed, not yet certain, only aware. The snow came in hard the following week and stayed. She had grown up in snow and knew what it wanted from you. It wanted attention, and it wanted patience, and it wanted every ounce of your respect, because the moment you stopped giving it those things, it would take more than you had offered. She banked the fires every 4 hours. She moved the extra feed to the near shed so Declan wouldn't have to cross the full yard in the worst of it. She kept a lantern by the back door and checked its oil every morning. One morning she woke to find the porch door frozen shut. She worked it free with hot water from the kettle and a knife along the frame. When he came through, he looked at the door and at the wet on the threshold and at her. He said, "I would have gotten that," she said. "I was up." He put on his coat and went to check the barn. She poured her coffee and stood at the window. The yard was deep in white and still, and the smoke from the bunkhouse chimney was going straight up in the windless air. She had not been warm inside in a long time before this house. Not in the way that matters. She was not thinking about leaving. He came back in from the barn and stomped the snow off his boots and poured the last of the coffee and stood at the other window, and they stood that way for a moment at separate windows, looking out at the same snow. Then he said, "I have to go into town for salt blocks. Tomorrow, if the road clears." She said, "I'll come." He looked at her. She said, "I need lamp oil, and I want to look at the seed catalogs at the dry goods." He said, "You're thinking about a garden," she said. "I'm thinking about spring." He turned back to the window. He was quiet long enough that she counted the silence and didn't know what she was counting. He said, "There's a good spot on the south side. Gets sun most of the day." She said, "I thought so." He looked at her then with something she had seen before in different people and different places, a recognition that cost something, not anything bad. Only the acknowledgement that something was settling that neither of them had exactly agreed to, and yet both of them had been moment by moment choosing. He said, "I'll need an early I start." She said, "I'll have coffee ready." He nodded and put his cup in the basin and went back out. She stayed at the window. Outside, Opal stood at the fence again, in the cold, patient and gray, her breath making shapes in the air that the wind immediately dissolved. She watched until he crossed the yard and reached over the fence and laid a hand on the mare's neck. Not petting, just resting there a moment. And then he went on to the barn. She turned and went to look at the seed catalog she'd been holding in her mind for 2 months. Spring was not here yet. But she had started planning for it, and that was a kind of answer she hadn't needed to say out loud. The town road cleared by afternoon. They left at first light. She was on the bench before him, her coat buttoned and her hands in her lap. He came out carrying 2 crates and loaded them in the back without asking her to move, without asking anything. He climbed up and gathered the reins, and Opal moved. The road was rutted from the freeze and packed again, and the cold was clean, and the sky above, the bare cottonwoods, was gray and enormous. She watched it. Beside her, he drove the way he always drove, without hurry, without any part of him given over to performance. The reins moved in small adjustments through his hands, conversation with the animal. She had come to like that sound. When they reached town, she went to the dry goods and he went to the feed store, and they met back at the wagon without planning to, the way 2 people meet when they know each other, well enough that arrangement isn't necessary. Beryl was coming out of the post office as they were loading. She looked at them, at the wagon, at the easy way they moved around each other without looking, and she smiled at a point between them. She didn't say anything. She went on down the street. That was Beryl's particular grace, knowing when a thing had already been said. He lifted the last salt block into the wagon bed, which she had been holding since the dry goods. He took it and set it in. He said, "Anything else?" She said, "No." He climbed up. She climbed up beside him. Opal stood patient and gray and did not wait to be told twice. The road home was the same road and the same cold sky and the same bare trees, and none of it was the same. She didn't say anything about that. She looked at the road going out ahead of them and the ridge rising to the north with its line of dark pine and the smoke already visible from the chimney she had left burning. Home is the smoke you can find from a distance. Her mother had told her that. She had not thought about it in years. He turned the wagon onto the ranch track. She was already thinking about the south side garden, about what would go in first and what would follow, about the window in her room, and the light that would come through it in spring, longer and warmer than the winter light, falling at a different angle across the floor. She was thinking about all of it. He set the brake. She climbed down. The yard was quiet and the barn was warm, and the coffee she'd left on the back of the stove would still be good. She got the door.